Scientists spent years collecting DNA samples from every corner of the planet, from the frozen steppes of Siberia to the rainforests of Central Africa, from the highlands of Papua New Guinea to the deserts of the American Southwest. They mapped, sequenced, compared, and ranked the genetic lineages of every major human population on Earth. And when the results came back, one group didn't just top the list. They shattered every expectation scientists had built over decades of research. What they found wasn't just surprising, it rewrote the entire timeline of what it means to be human. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Before we get into what scientists actually found, let's talk about how they measured something like genetic age in the first place. This is not as simple as testing a blood sample and reading a number off a machine. Scientists use something called a molecular clock. Think of your DNA like a book that has been copied by hand, generation after generation, for hundreds of thousands of years. Every time a scribe copies the book, they make tiny random mistakes. For example, a letter swapped here or a word changed there. Over enough generations, those mistakes accumulate. The more different two populations' DNA books look from each other, the longer ago their scribes went separate ways. By counting how many of those tiny differences, called mutations, exist between populations, and by knowing roughly how often mutations occur, geneticists can estimate how long ago any two lineages diverged from a common ancestor. The older the lineage, the more ancient the split, the more mutations have accumulated on independent paths. When scientists applied this method to every human population on Earth, the results were staggering. The study that changed everything wasn't one paper. It was the convergence of several major genomic projects: the Human Genome Diversity Project, the 1000 Genomes Project, and more recently the African Genome Variation Project, all pointing at the same conclusion from different angles. Researchers collected genetic samples from more than 100 distinct populations spanning every inhabited continent. They sequenced mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited only through the mother and acts as a kind of genetic timestamp. They analyzed Y chromosome haplogroups passed from father to son, and they mapped autosomal DNA, the full genome, to reconstruct population trees going back hundreds of thousands of years. When they built the family tree of all living humans, ranking lineages by how long ago they branched from the root of the human family, one finding dominated every analysis: Sub-Saharan African populations, and one group in particular carried DNA lineages so ancient they made every other population on Earth look genetically young by comparison. Here is where the story gets remarkable. The oldest known maternal lineage in all of living humanity is called haplogroup L0. It is a classification of mitochondrial DNA, the genetic code passed directly from mother to child in an unbroken chain. Every human alive today traces their mitochondrial lineage back to a single ancestral population in Africa. Scientists call the hypothetical woman at the root of that lineage mitochondrial Eve. But the people who live closest to that root, the people whose DNA has changed the least from that original ancestral population, are the Khoisan people of southern Africa. The San, sometimes called Bushmen, are a group of hunter-gatherers who have lived across southern Africa for an almost incomprehensible span of time, and their DNA carries haplogroup L0D, the earliest diverging branch of the entire human mitochondrial tree. Research published in Nature and confirmed across multiple independent studies has estimated that the L0D lineage is approximately 172,000 years old. Not 17,000, not 70,000, 172,000 years old, with a confidence range extending up to 199,000 years. That means the San people carry a direct, traceable maternal lineage that has been unbroken for longer than any other lineage in the human family. To put that in perspective, by the time the ancestors of Europeans and East Asians were just beginning to separate from each other, roughly 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, the San people's lineage had already been genetically distinct and continuous for well over 100,000 years. And it's not just the maternal line. The story is the same on the paternal side. Y chromosome studies, tracking the DNA passed from father to son, have also identified the most ancient male lineages as belonging to Sub-Saharan African populations. The deepest rooting branches of the human Y chromosome tree are found among African hunter-gatherers. Scientists sometimes call the theoretical common ancestor of all male lineages Y chromosomal Adam. Like mitochondrial Eve, his lineage traces back to Africa, with the oldest surviving branches still carried by men living there today. The pattern holds no matter which part of the genome you look at, no matter which inheritance path you follow. Every road leads back to Africa, but that's just one group. What about African populations broadly? This is where the finding becomes even more profound and more counterintuitive than almost anything else in modern genetics. When scientists measured the total genetic diversity across human populations worldwide, they discovered something that defied the instincts of anyone who grew up thinking of Africa as one thing. Africans as a whole are more diverse than the entire rest of the world combined. Let that sink in for a moment. Every person outside of Africa, every European, East Asian, South Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander, and Middle Easterner alive today represents a subset of the genetic diversity that already existed within Africa before anyone left. According to research from the University of Pennsylvania's Tishkoff lab, involving over 100 distinct African populations, the average African genome contains nearly 1 million more genetic variants than the average non-African genome. 1 million more. The study, published in Science, found that the populations of Africa harbor more DNA differences between one another than exist between a European and a Japanese person. Two individuals from different sub-Saharan African groups can be more genetically distinct from each other than a Norwegian is from a Korean. This is not a small statistical blip. It is the fundamental signature of deep time. Why does Africa contain so much more genetic diversity than anywhere else? The answer is one of the most elegant concepts in evolutionary biology, and it involves a bottleneck and a handful of brave or desperate people. Imagine a jar containing 1,000 marbles of every color imaginable: deep reds, cobalt blues, pale whites, rich blacks, greens, yellows, purples, the full spectrum of color in countless shades. That jar is the genetic diversity of Africa, built up over hundreds of thousands of years of humans living, mixing, separating, and evolving in the most genetically rich continent on Earth. Now imagine someone reaching into that jar and grabbing a small handful, maybe 150 marbles, maybe 200. They carry that handful out and use it to start a brand new jar somewhere else. The new jar will have some of the colors from the original, but only the ones that happen to be in that handful. The full depth of blues, the rare purples, the subtle variations of green. Most of it gets left behind. That is exactly what happened when the ancestors of all non-Africans left the continent between 50,000 and 70,000 years ago. Geneticists call this the out of Africa bottleneck. A relatively small group of people migrated out of Northeast Africa, carrying with them only a fraction of the genetic diversity that already existed on the continent. As they spread across Asia, Europe, Australia, and eventually the Americas, each new migration was another handful taken from an already reduced jar. Each founder effect, each small group settling a new land, stripped away more variation. The result? Every population outside Africa is genetically younger, genetically narrower, and genetically less diverse than the populations they left behind. Africa did not just produce humanity. Africa kept most of humanity's genetic history intact, layered, and ancient within its borders. Now here is where it gets even more fascinating, and where scientists' assumptions started collapsing one by one. When researchers from Harvard Medical School, led by population geneticist David Reich, analyzed ancient DNA from individuals across southeastern Africa, they found that some African populations had been genetically isolated from each other for extraordinary stretches of time. Not decades, not centuries, hundreds of thousands of years. Reich's team discovered that 3 ancestral African populations show patterns of divergence that predate any population separation seen elsewhere on Earth, while Europeans and East Asians separated from each other perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. Some ancestral African populations show genetic separation going back 200,000 years, and then came back together between 80,000 and 50,000 years ago. Think about what that means. These populations were genetically isolated from each other for longer than modern humans have existed in Europe, and yet they all remained in Africa. They represent deep, parallel branches of the human family tree, branches that existed simultaneously on the same continent, carrying different evolutionary histories, different adaptations, different genetic stories, before reconnecting and mixing in ways that created the extraordinary diversity we measure today. Europe and Asia show relatively shallow genetic trees. Africa shows a forest. If you are finding this as fascinating as I did when I first came across it, take a moment to subscribe. This channel exists to bring you the genetic science that most people never hear about, research sitting in academic journals that should be changing how we understand human history. Every video we make is fact-checked, sourced, and built on the latest findings from the world's leading geneticists. Hit subscribe so you never miss one. Let's talk specifically about what was found when scientists sequenced the complete genomes of sand bushmen, because those results were jaw-dropping. In a landmark study published in Nature, researchers sequenced the complete genome of an indigenous sand hunter-gatherer from Namibia's Kalahari Desert. What they found rewrote the textbook on human genetic diversity. The Bushmen, the study concluded, appear more different from each other in terms of raw nucleotide substitutions across the genome than typical Asians and Europeans are from each other. 2 sand individuals from the same region can be more genetically distinct from each other than a European is from an East Asian. The sheer depth of variation within this single population reflects a lineage so long and so continuous that it has accumulated more diversity than populations separated by entire oceans. The 2011 study by Brennan and colleagues, published in a major peer-reviewed journal, found that the Khoisan San, along with the Sandawe and Hadza peoples of Tanzania, were the most genetically diverse humans of any group studied anywhere on Earth. Their high degree of genetic diversity, the researchers noted, strongly hints at the geographic origin point of anatomically modern humans. This was not a surprise to every scientist, but the scale of it, the sheer magnitude of the difference, stunned even veteran geneticists. Now, one of the most important things to understand is why this finding makes complete scientific sense and what it tells us about the nature of genetic age itself. Genetic diversity accumulates over time. The longer a population has been in a place, the more mutations it collects, the more variation it builds, the more branches its family tree grows. Africa has been home to anatomically modern humans for somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years, longer than any other region on Earth. That is hundreds of thousands of years of births, deaths, migrations, separations, and reunions, all adding layers to the genetic archive. Non-African populations, by contrast, have been established for a fraction of that time. East Asian populations descend from groups that arrived in the region perhaps 40,000 to 60,000 years ago. European populations show a complex history of multiple waves of migration, hunter-gatherers, Anatolian farmers, and steppe pastoralists all arriving and mixing within roughly the last 45,000 years. The indigenous populations of the Americas have been there for perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 years. In genetic terms, these are all recent stories. Africa's story is not recent. It is the oldest story humanity has. And the DNA of African populations, especially the San and Khoisan peoples of Southern Africa, is the living record of that story. Here is perhaps the most profound twist in all of this research. Scientists at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, working alongside researchers from Penn State, sequenced the genes of Southern African Khoisan people and matched their population history to Earth's climate record over the last 200,000 years. What they discovered was astonishing. For the majority of modern human history, For most of the past 200,000 years, the Khoisan were not a small, marginal population. They were the dominant human population on Earth. The majority group of living humans. Up until approximately 20,000 years ago, when the climate warmed after the last ice age and other populations began their explosive growth, the Khoisan and their ancestors represented the largest share of the human species on the planet. The world has changed dramatically since then. Population expansions, the Bantu migrations across Africa, the agricultural revolutions in the Middle East and China, and the colonization of every continent transformed the demographic map of humanity. Groups that were once small became billions. The Khoisan, today numbering only in the hundreds of thousands, became a remnant of what was once the dominant human story. But their DNA did not disappear. It is still there, still ancient, still carrying a record that reaches back further than any other living human lineage. Not because they are exceptional by design, but because they never left. They stayed in the place where humanity was born, and they carried the original archive with them. This is where the research collides with something larger than genetics. For centuries, a false hierarchy was constructed around the idea that African populations were somehow primitive, less evolved, or behind in the human story. That narrative was not science. It was ideology, a fabrication built in the 17th and 18th centuries by European scholars trying to justify colonial brutality with the language of natural order. Modern genetics does not just challenge that narrative, it obliterates it. If genetic age is a measure of depth, of how long a lineage has been carrying the human story, then the oldest, most genetically deep, most ancestrally rich populations on Earth are African, not European, not Asian, not any group outside the continent. The populations that other cultures have spent centuries calling primitive are, in the language of DNA, the elders of the human family. The Sand Bushmen, who live without permanent agriculture, without complex states, without the trappings of what some call civilization, are genetically the most ancient and diverse humans alive. Their lineage traces back to a time when Europe was buried under ice, when Asia had barely seen a footprint, when the Americas did not yet know a human voice. Genetics, when done honestly, has a way of rearranging every assumption we brought into the room. There is one more finding worth sitting with. Researchers studying the global distribution of mitochondrial haplogroups, the classification system for maternal lineages, discovered that all human mtDNA haplogroups everywhere in the world trace back to a single African root. Every lineage, from the haplogroups of Northern Europeans to the lineages of Native Americans to the mtDNA of East Asians, is downstream of the African Chet-El haplogroups, all of them. This means that every non-African maternal lineage is a branch that grew from an African trunk. The L lineages, L0, L1, L2, L3, are the ancestral structure. Everything else is what happened after a small group of people took that handful of marbles and walked out into the world. When researchers discovered haplogroup L7 in 2022, a previously unclassified eighth branch of African mtDNA, they estimated it to be approximately 100,000 years old, adding yet another ancient layer to a continent whose genetic complexity was already barely charted. As one researcher put it, Africa is so genetically rich that we are still discovering ancient lineages we had missed entirely. In 2024, a team from the University of Cape Town and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published results from the Oakhurst Rock Shelter in South Africa, the oldest ancient DNA ever recovered from the region. They sequenced 13 individuals spanning 10,000 years of human occupation. Their key finding was that the oldest genomes from the site were genetically near identical to the San and Khoikhoi groups living in the same region today. In Europe, 10,000 years of ancient DNA tells a story of massive population replacement, entirely new people sweeping in and replacing what came before. In Southern Africa, the story is almost the opposite. The people stayed, the lineage held, the DNA endured. So what does all of this mean for how we understand humanity? It means the story of human origins is not a story of multiple parallel beginnings. It is a story that starts in one place with one people and branches outward. The entire genetic diversity of humanity outside Africa is a derivative of what Africa already contained. The entire history of human migration out of Africa is a story of subsets, of founder effects, of reduced versions of a richer original. It means that when scientists talk about ranking populations by DNA age, Africa wins, not by a small margin, but by a magnitude that researchers continue to describe as humbling. The oldest lineages are African, the deepest branches are African, the most genetically diverse populations are African. And the people who sit closest to the root of the human family tree are a group of hunter-gatherers who have been living in the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa for at least 140,000 years, perhaps far longer. And it means that every human being alive today, regardless of where their ancestors ended up, carries DNA that traces back to that same African source. Every European, every Asian, every person who ever wondered where they really came from. The answer, in every case, begins in Africa. The science does not say we are all the same. It says something more interesting than that. It says we are all related, and that the oldest members of our family are still living on the continent where the entire story began. If this video changed something in how you think about human history, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, and we will read it together.